Hello everyone, I hope you're all having a great day today. Now, if you're a fan of Diary of a Wimpy Kid, you might know that Jeff Kinney never fails to make a new book each year. But are they always the same quality? Well, to be completely honest, all of them are actually really good. Even the worst Diary of a Wimpy Kid books are still way better than most books, because it is just such a phenomenal series. But in this video, I'm going to be ranking all of the Diary of a Wimpy Kid books from worst to best. Keep in mind though, this is just my opinion. I would love to hear how you'd rank them in the comment section down below. And for this list, I'm including the 19 books that are out in the main series as of right now, as well as the Rowley Jefferson spin-off trilogy. I'm not going to include like the do-it-yourself book because that's just an activity book, and I'm also not going to include the movie diary because that's a non-fiction book. But without any further ado, let's hop right into the ranking. Coming in last place is Double Down. And when it comes to this book, I feel like there's just too much stuff going on, and a lot of it doesn't really connect. This is one of the books where Greg kind of rambles on in a lot of different spots about certain things that don't really need to go into too much detail. And I will say there are some memorable parts in here, just individual sequences that I think are really funny. But just as a whole, this book just doesn't even feel that much like a book. It just feels like a bunch of random stuff piled together. And again, there's not really any bad book in this series. This is still worth reading.
I mean, it's alright, like...
But when you compare it to the others, it's just not anything that great. Coming in at number 21 is No Brainer. And this one is a little frustrating to me because it has a really good premise about the school being terrible. And it feels like it has something to say about society, where Greg feels like most of the school day is a waste of time and he's not even learning stuff, which I actually think is a decent message. But the reason this book frustrates me is because the back cover talks about how there's all this crazy stuff happening where they're going to have to move schools. And that does happen in the book. Greg has to move to a different school. But all of the super interesting and cool stuff doesn't happen until very late on in the book. It's only like the last 20-25 pages, something like that. And literally most of the book is just the setup with just Greg rambling about how the school is not very good. Coming in at number 20 is the first Rowley Jefferson book. And to be completely honest, I prefer Greg as the narrator. Just in general, his style of writing I like better, but it is nice just having the novelty of a book with Rowley being the narrator and seeing things from his perspective, especially with it showing how much of a jerk Greg really is. So I don't really have a strong opinion on this book. It's just a nice little novelty thing. Coming in at number 19 is Wrecking Ball, and there's definitely some funny bits in this book, some stuff to appreciate. This is also pretty much the last book in the series where Rowley actually contributed to the plot. But the reason this is lower on the list is I feel like just the idea of the Heffleys moving out of their house isn't actually the best, because you know from the start of their book they're not actually going to move. And as much of a jerk Greg is to Rowley, I don't think it's actually part of his character to be willing to move to a different town from Rowley. And I guess he did get a little emotional at the end, but I just think it's overall good that the Heffleys ended up not moving. But the thing is, that was just so predictable from the start of the book. Coming in at number 18 is Rowley Jefferson's Awesome Friendly Spooky Stories. And to be completely honest, this was a pleasant surprise.
Hey, that's pretty good.
There's not a big narrative from the beginning to the end of the book. It's essentially just these different spooky stories written by Rowley Jefferson. So it's not anything too crazy, but it is just kind of entertaining to read Rowley write these spooky stories that really aren't actually that scary. It's really just a pretty unique book. There aren't other books in the series like this, except I guess Double Down feels like it's a bunch of different stories. Coming in at number 17 is Big Shot, and this was a book where Jeff Kinney wanted to stick with the theme of sports throughout the book, so I do appreciate the consistency there, and it's super entertaining seeing Greg and his team fail so much in this book. But the one big problem I do have with this book is I don't understand why Rowley couldn't have been part of the team. It would have been the perfect chance to have Rowley have a big role in one of the stories once again, but instead he's only on like one page. So that's frustrating, but otherwise a pretty well written book that sticks with the theme of sports. Coming in at number 16 is Diaper Overload, and in the same way that Big Shot stuck with the theme of sports, this sticks with the theme of rock and roll and Rodrick's band. Now, it is a little weird because I feel like Rodrick is more of the main character in this book than Greg is, and a lot of the story is just Greg explaining what happened to Rodrick, which I guess Rodrick just told him every detail. But I actually do think there's some funny stuff with the Metallic Chihuahua band like coming back together at the end of the book, after they had appeared in all these different places in the book. and there's just some funny shenanigans with Rodrick's band throughout the book as well. Coming in at number 15 is Hard Luck, and when it comes to this book, it's pretty much about how Greg and Rowley are not friends anymore until the very end of the book they become friends again, which, to be completely honest, based on Rowley's behavior in the other books leading up to this, he just seemed very loyal to Greg, and I don't think it would actually be realistic for him to distance himself from Greg just because he got a girlfriend. But nonetheless, that's what happens in the story. And to be completely honest, while this isn't considered like an OG book, when you compare it to the books that are coming out now, it's pretty much an OG book. So there's just a lot of gimmicks and stuff that happens in this that's nice to appreciate, especially with Greg and the Magic 8 Ball. The one plot point where he tries to be friends with Fregley to get attention, and just a lot of funny stuff that happens in the book throughout. But at the end of the day, it's not the best of the best. Coming in at number 14 is Rowley Jefferson's Awesome Friendly Adventure, maybe the most underrated book on this list in my opinion. Most people actually aren't the biggest fan of this, but I think this is easily the best in the Rowley Jefferson trilogy. Especially the first time I read it, I just had a blast, which of course everything is better on the first read. But I just feel like with this book, there's just some funny stuff that Rowley imagines with these fantasy characters, and it's funny seeing Greg kind of influence his story. And I just like that it was something unique Jeff Kinney did. Instead of making just more regular books from Rowley's point of view, he did something a little different, and I really appreciate that. Coming in at number 13 is the newest book, Hot Mess. And yes, this is another like family road trip, but this time they do kind of bring something new to the table where instead of just Greg's immediate household family, it's his extended family that he's staying with. So there's just a lot of fresh stuff that happens, and it is kind of funny how his grandma was pulling the strings this whole time. So I just thought this was pretty entertaining, while at the same time still having the problem I've had with the most recent books, where there's too much stuff Greg just thinks about in his mind and then like visualizes it, and it just goes on a little bit too long and just derails a little bit from the main narrative. I used to be very impressed on how Jeff Kinney made every book 217 pages, but nowadays it just feels like he adds that random stuff every now and then just to fill some space up. Still though, this book doesn't do it to the extent that some of the more recent books have been doing it, so it's not really a huge problem, but just overall I thought this book was pretty solid. Coming in at number 12 is The Getaway, and this was the second time that the Heffleys took a vacation. Well, the first time was a road trip, and this time they went on planes, so that actually does make it a little fresh, because there's a huge sequence about the family at an airport as well as Greg on the airplane, and that might actually be my favorite part of this book, just the airport and an airplane, because it shows like how stressful that stuff can be, especially from a kid's perspective. But once they get to the island, there's just a lot of funny stuff that happens, especially towards the end where the Heffleys get kicked out and then they sneak back in. I will say when stuff like that happens, it's not quite as relatable as just like the simple road trips like in The Long Haul, but it still is pretty funny. Coming in at number 11 is The Third Wheel. And of course, a lot of people will say that the quality of the book started to drop around like this time period. But like I was saying with Hard Luck, when you compare the books from this time period to the books now, they are more similar to the OG books. But overall, I kind of like the stuff that goes on in this book, especially with the Valentine's Day dance. And just that whole sequence towards the end of the book is pretty funny. Now the rest of the book leading up to that isn't as strong, but it's still pretty entertaining, and there's a lot of memorable moments in here. Coming in at number 10 is The Deep End, and this is definitely one of the more underrated ones. Of course, this was another road trip, but I just feel like all the shenanigans that go on in here are actually pretty entertaining, and I do think it is kind of funny how Greg kind of makes friends with some of the other kids at the one place they go to. Of course, this book hasn't held up as well when I've reread it. I still rest my case that this is a good book. Coming in at number 9 is The Long Haul, and this was the very first road trip book, which of course we've gotten 3 other ones since. Of course, I guess The Getaway was an airplane, but still kind of a vacation. But just overall, this is really good because it was the first road trip book, so it felt the most fresh. And it was just something really new to do with the series, the Heffleys going on a road trip, and all this crazy stuff happening with them getting the pig and Greg being scared of that Mr. Beardo guy. It's just a shame that the movie did not live up to the legacy of the book.
This is not okay.
Coming in at number 8 is The Meltdown. This is a book on this list that I definitely think is underrated because you get to see a lot of Greg and Rowley just hanging out together, and it's during the school year. But at the same time, I feel like Jeff Kinney found something fresh to do with the winter theme. Of course, we already had the Cabin Fever book that was kind of a winter theme, but that book had to do with them being snowed in and stuff, and this book has to do with there being a giant snowball fight, and it establishes very early on the tension around the neighborhood between the different kids. My only complaint is that the whole plot of the street like having a hill was not established in prior books, but still I think this is one of the better modern books in the series. And of course I say modern, this is already a few years old. Coming in at number 7 is Dog Days. This was the very first book to take place in the summer season. Every other summer book since then has been a road trip or a vacation, but this does not have any of that. It's just classic Diary of a Wimpy Kid where Greg is at home and crazy stuff is still going on. Of course, you have his mom starting a book club and all that kind of stuff, and she also just wants him to go outside, and he really just wants to play video games. And this is just the classic Diary of a Wimpy Kid that I love. It's very simple and straightforward, but it's effective. Coming in at number 6 is the very original Diary of a Wimpy Kid book. This right here is where it all started, and it just became instantly iconic. Jeff Kinney did an amazing job with this book. And the thing that was so great about the original books, especially this one being the very first one, is just how relatable they are. Most of the humor from the modern Diary of a Wimpy Kid books coming out now is just from a bunch of crazy stuff happening, and it's not always the most realistic. But the original books, especially this first one here, were so good because of how relatable they were. And that's just what made them so memorable. And of course, this is the book that introduced us to all these great characters like our narrator, Greg, the rest of the Heffley family, and people like Rowley, Jefferson, and Fregley. Coming in at number 5 is Rodrick Rules. And this book took everything that worked about the first one and just kind of expanded on it with more funny stuff happening. And we got to see more of Rodrick Heffley in the spotlight. Which, to be completely honest, he is a great character. He is one of the best Diary of a Wimpy Kid characters, so it is nice seeing more of him. And I really don't have much else to say about like the books like these because they were just so simple and straightforward, but they were really good. Coming in at number 4 is Old School. I want to say this is the best modern book, but I just remembered that this is like almost 10 years old at this point, so this really isn't even a modern book anymore. But this is easily the most underrated book in the series because it has to do with the idea of how people depend on electronics and that kind of stuff. You have Greg that loves all the technology, but then he has to be without it at the one camp with Silas Scratch. There's also that one community service part where Greg runs away with the juvenile delinquent and that one little kid. There's just some great stuff in this book. I cannot stress enough how underrated this is. Bringing us into the podium is The Ugly Truth. And this is the book where Greg was entering 8th grade, I guess, if you look at the timeline. And it kind of has to do with him hitting puberty and being curious. But it really doesn't like dive too deep into that because obviously it's a family-friendly book. But at its core, it's really more so about him trying to mature and understand stuff and be more wise. And you have the whole family get together for Uncle Gary's like 4th wedding. So there's just a lot of interesting stuff Greg experiences in this book. And of course, it is very funny. And also in this book, there was some tension between Greg and Rowley that was set up in the 4th book. But once you get to the end of the book, that kind of disappeared. And so just at the end of the day, this is one of those classic books that's really funny. And while the plot is straightforward, I feel like this might have the deepest themes out of all the books in this series. Coming in at number 2 is Cabin Fever. This book was kind of centered around Christmas and that kind of stuff, but I just really like the vibe of this book. This truly is one of the more heartwarming books in the series, as well as just one of the funnier ones, where you have the Heffleys being stuck in their house due to the snowstorm. But just the book leading up to that with all the stuff going on at Greg's school, I just find it pretty interesting. You also have the part in the book where Greg and Rowley are like criminals, but just everything that happens in this book connects together very well. And I know a lot of people on the internet will say that this is like where the OG books ended. This was like the last OG good book, and I can definitely see where they're coming from when they say that. But coming in at number 1 is The Last Straw. And this book kind of focuses on Greg's relationship with his dad, where obviously he wants his dad to be proud of him, but they just have so many differences, and his dad wants to ship him off to military school. But once you get to the ending, it's super satisfying.
It was perfect. Perfect. Everything, down to the last minute details.
And I also just really like the dynamic between Greg and Rowley in this book. It's as strong as it ever is. And it's just nice how this continues to explore Greg being in middle school. There was still a lot of fresh stuff to do back then. So that's why this book is my favorite. But again, let me know your ranking in the comments section down below. As always, thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next one.